Timarchus in the Underworld. Brrr! Timarchus emerged shivering from the bubbling waters of the river, his arms and legs slightly scratched from the rocks. "That was bracing," he said, gratefully taking the towel Simmias offered him. "Well, you have a good dinner waiting for you. Yesterday's sacrificial goat," said Simmias, rubbing his friend vigorously to dry him off. "What is tonight's sacrifice to be?" "A ram," replied Timarchus. "They tell me that is the best animal to sacrifice on the day you plan to consult the oracle. And I have been here bathing only in this river for enough days. I will go down into the cave tonight." "Are you nervous?" asked Simmias. "Of course not," blustered Timarchus, biting his lip. "I am excited," he added. "They say this oracle takes you closer to the gods and the worlds outside of this one than any other in Greece." "What does your great teacher have to say about it?" asked Simmias. "He's not too keen on the gods, from what I hear." Timarchus snorted derisively. "Don't believe everything you hear," he said. "Socrates is as conscientious in his religious duty as any other man I know. Lamprocles always said his father was more devoted to the divine than anyone knew." His voice caught on Lamprocles' name, and Simmias placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Is Socrates doing all right?" Simmias asked. "I can't imagine what he and Lamprocles' mother are going through." "He has his philosophy to comfort him," Timarchus said. "He says either death is the simple ending of consciousness, in which case Lamprocles is in a peaceful, dreamless sleep, or he has gone to a place ruled over by just judges, in which case he will be happy. So either way, there is no need to mourn," though he had tears in his eyes as he said it. "Still, I have heard him, Socrates I mean, talk derisively about the stories of the gods," Simmias said hesitantly. "He surely does not believe in the realm of Hades as we know of it. And I am sure I once heard him say that there is no Zeus, and that rain comes not from the gods, but from the clouds." "That was in that play Aristophanes kept peddling, even though no one liked it," said Timarchus. "The one everyone's read a copy of, but no one's actually seen, because it came last in the competition at the Dionysia decades ago, and no one has wanted to produce a performance of it since." "Oh yes, so it was." Simmias shook his head. "It's funny how the mind can play tricks on you, isn't it? I could have sworn I heard him say that, but I can't have done. We were babes in arms when that play came out." "Anyway, it is not Zeus, Hera, or Apollo I have come looking for," said Timarchus, adding hastily, "no disrespect to them, of course. No, I am looking for the daimon Socrates talks about, the divine spirit that exists between and among and throughout gods and man. The spirit that journeys with us and watches over us, guiding us, if we listen. That is what I hope to find in Trophonius' cave." "Then I pray the gods are favourable," said Simmias, handing Timarchus his cloak. Timarchus nodded, and out loud insisted he was sure they would be. When the time came to sacrifice the ram and for the priest of the shrine to poke around in its entrails to tell him whether the omens were favourable or not, he kept up his smile. But as he watched the priest silently considering the bulbous, strangely coloured mass of animal parts before him, he found himself pleading with his eyes, staring the priest right in the face and letting his desperation show. "Come on, man," he begged silently. "Let it be tonight." He could have sworn he saw the priest nod, almost imperceptibly, and then, with a last dramatic flourish of a bit of intestine, the man loudly declared that the gods were favourable to his request, and that Timarchus could descend into the cave to consult the oracle that very night. Freshly bathed, once again in the river and oiled, Timarchus was bristling with nervous energy as he followed the temple attendants. They still did not lead him to the oracle itself, not yet. Instead, they took him to a pair of fountains sitting right next to each other and clothed him in a linen tunic. A priest gestured to the fountain on the right. "Drink," he commanded. Timarchus sighed inwardly, but he carried on. The water tasted fresh and sweet. "As you drink the water of forgetfulness, may you forget all the troubles of your mind that have occupied your thoughts hitherto," intoned the priest. Timarchus wiped his mouth and realised everyone was standing around looking at him expectantly. The instructions he had been given while he was being scrubbed and oiled came back to him, and he approached a second priest who stood by the second fountain. Timarchus took a deep breath. "I am a son of earth and starry sky," he said. "I am parched with thirst and am dying, but quickly grant me cold water from the fountain of memory to drink." The priest moved aside and, like the other, simply intoned, "Drink." "Now you will remember what you see and hear during your time with the spirit," said the first priest. "Come and make your request," said the second. The two priests guided Timarchus to a niche carved out of the rock of the mountainside and pulled apart a curtain. A statue was revealed, a little bigger than life-size, displaying the spirit god Trophonius. It had been made by the famous sculptor Daedalus, so they said. Timarchus could not help thinking it looked remarkably like a regular statue of the healing god Asclepius, a tall, bearded man, almost naked to the waist, wearing a loosely draped long tunic slung carelessly over one shoulder and leaning on a staff. The only thing missing was his familiar snake entwined around it. Nevertheless, he knelt before the statue while the priests burned sweet incense and prayed fervently to the spirit god. He wasn't even quite sure what he was praying for. Reassurance of some kind, he supposed. To know that he would see Lamprocles again, someday, somewhere, in some form. To know that there was more between earth and the heavens than his philosophy could dream of. The attendants girded his tunic with ribbons and gave him a pair of local leather boots, and then he was finally ready to descend into the deep cave to consult the oracle itself. He was taken around the mountain to an opening in the rock, inside which was a man-made room of sorts with a white marble circular floor. At the other side was a bronze door, and beyond that a deep well, clearly man-made as well, in the semicircular shape of a bread oven. A narrow, light ladder was brought in by the priests, who slung it down into the hole and gestured to Timarchus to climb down. Below, he found another hole in the ground. As instructed, he lay on his back with his feet in the hole, and the priests passed him barley cakes flavoured with honey to hold. Timarchus shuffled himself slowly forward until his knees were in that deeper hole. Then suddenly he felt his whole body be swept downwards as if he had fallen feet first into a river. He found himself in total darkness, clutching his barley cakes and lying completely still for fear of whatever might be lurking in the depths of the mountain. He prayed once more to the spirit god, a vague, uncertain reaching out, a desperate call for something, anything, to break the darkness. Suddenly he heard an almighty crash and felt something cold and heavy hit him hard on the head. At that moment he felt like his skull opened up and his soul flew out of his body. Looking down, he saw his body, a deeper shadow among the shadows, lying motionless and empty, claw-like hands still clutching the barley cakes. But his soul left that empty shell behind and flew upwards, emerging out of the darkness into a place of pure light. He felt himself growing outwards and expanding, spreading out like a sail and mingling with the air. He was full of a feeling of deep joy, and everything around him felt fresh and clean and beautiful. He could hear a strange sound overhead, as if something was revolving, like a giant rhombus in the sky. It was not an alarming sound. It sounded very pleasant to his ears. Timarchus suddenly remembered that he had no ears, and giggled, though in theory he had no mouth either. His soul seemed to remember its former shape, and take on something resembling it as a form of comfort, like a child who clutches a beloved doll. Forming himself into a body he could control, he lifted his soul's head and looked around him. He could not see the shrine, nor the mountain, nor any of the earth at all. Instead, he could see countless huge, perfectly round islands spread out below him in an endless blue sea. Each seemed to be lit by a fire all of its own, and they burned with bright colours that shifted and moved across them with the light in an endless rainbow. Each was spinning gently and moving along with the current, all of them migrating in an everlasting circle, creating the most beautiful music he had ever heard. In some places the sea appeared to be deep and dark, in others shallow. In some places it appeared bright, in others dark like a deep pool. Towards the middle, 2 rivers of fire burst through the waters and poured into each other, forcing the boiling water back in waves of white foam. Nearby, Timarchus saw a great gaping hole where it looked like an island had been wrenched from its path. He could see an endless abyss, too deep and dark to measure, full of a darkness that moved and writhed and welled up, threatening to spill out over the edge and into the beautiful blue sea. As Timarchus passed over it, he could hear a terrible cacophony of wailing and groaning rising up from the depths. The cries and weeping of men and women and the screams of children mingled with the roars and whining of animals, all together in a horrendous fountain of sound that spurted up and seemed almost to want to drag Timarchus in. Around the black hole, Timarchus saw a multitude of shooting stars. Some seemed to quiver and tremble and hover around the abyss, bouncing around in the air like corks in water, as if trying to decide where to go. Some sank right into the darkness, disappearing into its depths, their light extinguished. Others seemed to be shooting up from within the chasm, bursting out and escaping its shadows, flying straight up and into the light. "What is this place?" Timarchus wondered aloud. "That is the Styx," said a voice behind him. Timarchus turned, and to his delight he saw the myriad colours of the air swirl together to form the outline of the shape of Lamprocles. His cheeky, crooked smile shone out of the echo of his face as the bodiless beings they had both become faded into the air and merged with each other. "I always thought the Styx was a river," said Timarchus in wonder, reaching out to take the outline of Lamprocles' hand. "It is a path," said Lamprocles. "It extends from the depths of Hades, as you see, all the way up to the light above, ever revolving with the rest of the spheres." "I had thought that death led to rebirth in a new life," said Timarchus, "that my soul would find its way to a new body and be reborn." "You were not wrong," said Lamprocles. "Everyone here is on that journey, until they reach the time when their endless cycle of life is due to end. Then they swim up from below and the moon takes them in, unless they have polluted themselves by criminal behaviour. If anyone truly wicked approaches, the moon roars with a terrible anger, and lightning carves out the heavens and forbids them, and they scream as they are swept downwards again to another birth and a fresh cycle of lives. Others, whose cycle is not yet completed, slip off the path and cry out in terror and are carried away by Hades." "I always thought the stars belonged in the heavens," mused Timarchus thoughtfully, watching the passage of the tiny points of light as they danced around and into and out of the abyss. "Those are not stars," said Lamprocles. "They are the daimones, the divine spirits of each and every human being. Every human soul, mingled with human flesh and passions, has a higher part attached to it. People call it the mind, but in reality it is these beings you see as stars, the daimones. In some people, the daimon and the soul and the flesh become so inextricably commingled that the body pulls the soul and the daimon into itself, and drags both down with it into the depths of Hades, succumbing to all the passions and distractions and pleasure and pains of human living. In some, the daimon mingles only in part with the rest, and so it is not dragged down with them, but floats like a buoy to the top. When the body and soul are dragged below, the daimon breaks off and floats away, and there you see them, flying up out of the depths, shaking off a sort of dimness and darkness the way you might shake off mud. Then they are lighted again, and fly up to join those already on high, the spirits of those who remained above the passions and distractions of the world all along." "Some seem to move more directly than others," Timarchus said, watching the uncertain bobbing about of many of the stars below him. "Our souls are like animals which our daimon must train," said Lamprocles. "Some resist the training and must be punished many times over before they reach an understanding, but others are obedient to the voice of their daimon in their ear from the beginning. It is those souls who become prophets, diviners, and philosophers." "I do not understand any of this," said Timarchus, watching the stars' endless whirling patterns below him. "You will," said Lamprocles, and Timarchus heard sadness in his voice. "In the 3rd month from now you will understand all these things. For now it is time for you to go." Timarchus felt as if loving hands gave him a gentle push, and suddenly he was borne away by the wind, spreading out into nothingness in the air. Timarchus felt a sharp pain in his head, and he felt as if his whole skull was being violently compressed and squeezed back together. When he opened his eyes, he saw only darkness, but a gentle exploration with his hands showed him that he was still lying in Trophonius' cave, still clutching the barley cakes, though these were inexplicably dry and crumbled in his grip. Timarchus awkwardly shifted himself backwards until he managed to wriggle out of the hole, and carefully he climbed the ladder back up to the entrance of the shrine. He went slowly and gingerly, for his head was pounding. He had several spells of dizziness along the way, when the whole earth seemed to tip and turn around him. Eventually he emerged into a bright, sunny morning. It was cold, but spring was in the air, and he could hear birdsong coming from the trees. Timarchus was expecting to see the priests waiting for him, but there was no one around. He made his way, slightly wobbly on his feet, down to the statue of Trophonius and the fountains, and from there to the lodge where he had been staying. Here he finally found some signs of human life, for Simmias was sleeping in the same spot Timarchus himself had been occupying. "Simmias, do you want to consult the oracle yourself now?" Timarchus said, keeping his tone light despite his annoyance. "They can give you your own bed, you know." "Timarchus!" cried Simmias with joy, and he jumped out of the bed and hugged Timarchus so hard neither man could quite breathe properly. "Hello," said Timarchus uncertainly. "Is everything all right?" "We had given you up for dead," cried Simmias. "You have been down there for 2 nights and a day. We thought the god had taken you for his own." "Not yet," said Timarchus, thinking of the sadness in Lamprocles' eyes at their parting. "What happened?" demanded Simmias. "I will tell you everything if you give me a good breakfast," said Timarchus. "But you must promise me something, Simmias. You must promise to repeat it all to Socrates when you see him again. He will want to know." "You can tell him yourself," said Simmias. "If not before, we will see him at Agathon's party in about 4 months' time. You know he will never miss one of Agathon's parties." "You will have to tell him for me," said Timarchus. "Now come, and maybe bring a wax tablet and stylus, and take some notes." The end. Hello, welcome back to Creepy Classics. I'm Ed Harrisson, and this is the podcast retelling and discussing ancient, medieval, and early modern ghost stories, with episodes every 2 months. Please forgive any strange sounds in the background of weird pitter-patter noises of little feet. That is the puppy. He is not quite used to being quiet while I record things just yet. I think I'm going to have to re-record the story itself later. This month's episode is not technically a ghost story, it's a near-death experience. There are a few ancient reports, sections from ancient texts, that appear to describe what we would categorise as a near-death experience. Near-death experiences are a phenomenon that recurs across different times and places, different cultures. There can be differences in how they manifest themselves in different cultures. There can be cultural variations in some of the specifics. But the core aspect of a near-death experience is that somebody is usually near death, although can also happen in cases of isolation, fear, or meditation, that kind of thing. And they will experience some few of a list of elements that will occur frequently in this kind of experience. It's all a bit vague because they vary between different cultures, but basically Marinus van der Sluijs has identified 16 characteristic elements of a near-death experience. And basically, you don't have to have all 16, but you would expect a near-death experience to demonstrate some of these to be classified as such. So in addition to either being near death or in some other kind of extreme mental state, the 16 characteristic elements are an out-of-body experience. That's the feeling of existing outside of your own body and often being able to see your body from wherever you are. Sound accompanying the out-of-body experience. Seeing an otherworldly or beautiful landscape, or in a very small percentage of cases, seeing what he puts in inverted commas as a hellish landscape or a hellish experience. Obviously not necessarily the Christian concept of hell, but in the English language, that's often the kind of easiest, briefest way to describe a very unpleasant experience involving torture and screams and wailing and gnashing of teeth and so on. And then, carrying on from that, an encounter with a being of light or a guide, some kind of flash forward, vision of the future, something like that, a forced return to the body, difficulty in describing what has been seen, that one there is a lot of variation, otherwise obviously you wouldn't have any descriptions of them, awareness of being dead, absence of pain, and often in the case of people who are near death, the resumption of pain when they go back into the body. Passage towards a bright light. In Western examples, this is often described specifically as through a tunnel, but not all examples include the tunnel. An encounter with deceased people, often including relatives or friends. Life review, that's a formal way of saying your life flashing before your eyes. An experience of a boundary, a conscious return to the body, and a changed lifestyle afterwards. Often people who have near-death experiences feel that they are very changed people after the fact. I'm particularly interested in near-death experiences for 2 reasons. The most important and personal one is that my mother has had at least 1, if not 2, and if you're wondering how she's managed to be near-death so often, she worked and lived in Belfast in the 1970s, so that's how. And my PhD student, Gregory is currently working on a PhD on near-death experiences in Greek and Roman literature. So the inspiration for this episode obviously comes from Gregory's work. He's the one who alerted me to these near-death experiences in ancient literature. So thank you, Gregory. Gregory's written 2 books on near-death experiences before because he's done a lot of work on them in other cultures. The reason that I'm supervising his PhD, which is his second PhD, is because he's not an expert in Greek and Latin texts, But he has written about near-death experience in indigenous religions and a more general book on extraordinary experiences of the afterlife. So you can check those out. For ancient near-death experiences in particular, I've been looking in particular at an article by Marinus van der Sluijs, who looked in particular at 3 near-death experiences from ancient literature, Plato's myth of and 2 from Plutarch, an experience by somebody called Thespesius, which is the name he takes after the near-death experience because it changes him, and the subject of this story, the myth of Timarchus, or story of Timarchus. The story of Thespesius from Plutarch is the closest to the sort of report of near-death experiences that we see across cultures and across times and places. And I may end up doing that one another time. The myth of I thought about doing, but the myth of is the opposite of that. The myth of is a piece of philosophy, and although it can be classified as a near-death experience because it meets enough of the criteria, the way Plato tells it is really more, it's an exploration of ideas about justice. It occurs at the end of Plato's text, The Republic, which is all about the ideal republic and how the ideal republic would function. So it's sort of about Plato's views of the afterlife, but it's really much more about the philosophy of justice and that kind of thing. I chose this one as being in between the two. It's not quite as close to a typical, if there is a typical near-death experience, as Thespesius, but it is closer than the myth of while still being a clear echo of the myth of deliberately so. Plutarch knows his Plato, and it obviously echoes the myth of in many ways and is set up in a similar way, coming at the end of a text by Plutarch on the Daimonion of Socrates. Timarchus is not actually near death in this scenario, although he is unconscious for quite a long time, and van der Sluijs flagged it up as an NDE, noting that they can happen even when not near death, although obviously more typically they happen when someone is near death. And they happen to something like 9 or 10% of people who come very close to death, so people who have a cardiac arrest, who are clinically dead for a period of time, or very, very close to dying, that kind of thing. And about 9 or 10% of people who experience that situation will experience a near-death experience. Like the related phenomenon of sensed presence, where people feel like they can feel another presence near them or even hear a voice, this is something that is observable across times and places, and then how you explain what it is where there is more difference of opinion. You could explain it scientifically as something medical happening to the brain. You could explain it theologically, spiritually. There are lots of different possible explanations. But the fact that the thing happens is observable and recognisable. And although it's not technically a ghost story because Timarchus is not dead, and also it's more of what in ancient literature we would call a catabasis, which is a journey to the underworld, than a ghost story, I thought it would be interesting to cover as a related story type, also dealing with ancient beliefs about the afterlife. And I think near-death experiences are really interesting. As ever, I have, of course, made some adjustments in the adaptation of the story. I haven't just translated Plutarch. That would be pointless. There are plenty of good translations out there. First of all, Socrates' eldest son Lamprocles was actually still alive when Socrates was executed, but it was Plutarch that changed that. This text is all about Socrates' ideas about the daimon, which I shall come back to, and Plutarch sets it some years after Socrates has died. He has this whole framing device with people involved in war in Thebes. There's a lot more to this text that I'm not going into in this episode. It's a very complex philosophical text, and this story appears right at the end of it. And I'm really just focusing on how it relates to afterlife belief, but there is so much more to this text, so if you're interested, definitely check out some of the references I'll give at the end of the video. It is an absolutely fascinating text in general, and there's a lot to it. In the case of the timeline of Socrates and Lamprocles' deaths, Plutarch just does that. This is just a thing Plutarch does. Plutarch moved the dream Julius Caesar had about having his way with his mother from where other texts say that happened when Caesar is relatively young and he's off in Spain, to much closer to the civil war with Caesar and Pompey, to the moment the civil war starts, as Caesar crosses the river Rubicon and declares war on Rome. And Plutarch puts this historically attested dream there because it's more dramatically effective there, because Caesar is about to invade the motherland. So messing with history to suit his story is just something Plutarch does, and something I do as well because I am a writer, although unlike Plutarch I'll tend to try and flag it up. There are a few famous Timarchuses, but this is not any of them. Scholars think he might just be an invention of Plutarch's. He's supposed to come from Chaeronea, which is Plutarch's home. Plutarch and Pausanius, who is our other main source for the Oracle of Trophonius, both lived and wrote much, much later than this would supposedly take place. Socrates was executed in 399 BCE, and Plutarch's writing around the end of the first, beginning of the 2nd century CE, and Pausanias in the 2nd century CE. So they're both living and writing centuries later. And Plutarch calls this the mythos, the story of Timarchus. So it could be a work of fiction. Something that Gregory talks a lot about in his work and in his PhD work that I think is a very interesting and sensible way of looking at it is that these fictional stories that seem to describe near-death experiences in a way that does map on to other more historical near-death experiences may be inspired by a real near-death experience that the writer knows of, that happened to them or somebody they know, or that they've heard about, but they've fictionalized it for their own purposes. And that's more or less my assumption here, that most of this is just Plutarch's fiction. Yeah, he's making it up. He calls it a mythos, a story. He's not claiming otherwise. It's a philosophical metaphor. But some elements of it may have been inspired by real reports of near-death experiences that he was aware of, and that would explain how this fictional story does actually match some elements of real near-death experiences. The story obviously can't take place historically because Socrates is alive and Lamprocles is dead, but I would assume it's around 400-401 BCE if it were to really take place before the execution of Socrates. A lot of my description of the ritual at the Oracle of Trophonius is from Pausanias, his description of Greece from the 2nd century CE. Pausanias describes the ritual at the oracle, which was still going when he was writing. He specifies that consultants ate the sacrificial victims during the preparation period, and that a ram was the best animal for the day you are intending to actually consult the oracle. I've also added some dialogue from the Orphic or Bacchic gold tablets to the ritual because there seem to be clear connections between the ritual at this oracle and several elements of various mystery cults, including the cult of Orpheus or Bacchus. These gold tablets are found in graves from across the classical Greek through to the Roman periods. They cover an enormous amount of time and space, and they have these ritual texts on them which have instructions for the deceased as they go into the afterlife. And they refer a lot to lakes, to springs, to water. Don't drink from this spring. Go and drink from the lake of memory, and so on and so forth. And there seem to be some clear connections between that and the ritual described by Pausanias. So I just added some of the text from the ritual to the ritual that I've described here. The bit about the statue of Trophonius looking like Asclepius is actually from Pausanias, though he says only those consulting the oracle are allowed to see it, so he doesn't really say how he knows that. I call Trophonius a spirit god because it's not clear exactly what Trophonius was. This is probably an example of hero cult, which is a part of Greek religion where the people being worshipped are mortals from Greek mythology. So they're not gods, or they weren't initially gods in the stories. They start out as mortals, but then they get worshipped as gods. And these are generally not historical people. These are people who are said to have lived a very long time ago, who are mythological. Characters like Achilles, who was worshipped in various places across Greece, sort of like Heracles, although Heracles has more of a divine aspect to him anyway, usually. And in fact, Asclepius, the son of Apollo, also has elements of hero cult to his cult as well. The Oracle of Trophonius appears to have been an incubation oracle. That is an oracle where you go and you sleep in the sanctuary and you ask for a dream from the god. Pausanias doesn't specify the sleep exactly, but it seems like that kind of ritual. Incubation oracles are most often healing shrines, so many of them are in fact oracles of Asclepius, which might be another reason the statue looks like Asclepius. They are not exclusively healing shrines, but a lot of them are. and people would go and pray for a dream that would heal them, cure them, or for the god to tell them a cure in a dream. And this oracle of Trophonius seems to be a mix of the sort of thing you get at incubation oracles, where you also sacrifice an animal, could be a ram or a goat, and you sleep on its skin usually, if it's an incubation oracle, with elements of oracles of the dead, which are a type of oracle where you are trying to contact the dead. They are what they sound like, and which often involve going underground and near water. And the descent into the cave wearing a linen tunic and experience of being near the underworld is also reminiscent of the description of initiation into the cult of Isis from Apuleius' novel Metamorphoses, which is also 2nd century CE. So there's another connection with mystery cults there. My description of Timarchus' experiences has been adapted. I have not reproduced what Plutarch says exactly. I've tried to create a slightly stronger narrative, something that feels more like an experience and less like a philosophy lesson, because Plutarch's text, like Plato's myth of is designed to get across philosophical concepts, and it's quite kind of, well, here's this over here, and here's this over here, and this is what this is doing, this is what this is doing. And I wanted something more character-driven, and that felt more like something you might actually experience if you are having this kind of out-of-body experience, rather than a teacher telling you something. Also in Plutarch, it is a voice of somebody behind him that Timarchus, as he turns around to look at them, he ends up going back to his body, so he doesn't know who they are. He doesn't see Lamprocles specifically. I added that bit. That is something that features a lot in near-death experiences, that people often see deceased loved ones, and obviously it just made it a bit of a stronger story as a work of fiction. I've kept as much as possible of Plutarch's details, but I have streamlined a lot of the kind of philosophical description of the underworld stuff and tried to keep it a bit more personal. I've also pinched a line from Shakespeare because I like to do that whenever I get a chance. Shakespeare knew what he was doing. A rhombus is a bull roarer, an instrument you play by swinging a bit of wood around on a longish string to make a vibrating sound, and again is often used in rituals relating to mystery cults. Shocker. Where I have reproduced the philosophical theory, I have stuck mainly to the bits most relevant to afterlife belief and to daimons or daimones in the Greek plural, ancient Greek plural. Socrates' views on life after death are reported in Plato's Apology after he is condemned to death himself. His conception of the daimon appears in many, many different works. In Cicero's Roman text on divination, it behaves a bit like a guardian angel, almost. And Plutarch describes it almost like a version of the Roman genius. The Roman genius is not quite the same thing as usually a daimon would be. In other works, a daimon is often a spirit that exists between gods and mortals, between gods and man. A Roman genius is the divine aspect of a human soul, of a human person, usually a man, but there are some references to a female genius. Plutarch does seem to mean different things by the word in different texts, which doesn't help. But going on this text and how it comes across here, it does seem to be primarily something very similar to the Roman genius, which is the Latin word that was usually used to translate daimon when Greek texts were translated into Latin, and with an element of the guardian angel or the conscience on your shoulder type idea that would appear in later Christian thought as well. I also described Timarchus' soul as flying out of his body. That's something we see a lot in Greek art and literature, the idea that psyche, the soul, flies out of the body at the moment of death, and you see this envisaged on ancient Greek pots quite a lot, where the psyche can literally be a little tiny figure with wings flying away from the body in battle scenes from the Trojan War story usually. I also mentioned whether or not Socrates believes in the gods or whether he kind of respects the gods. This is one of the great debates around Socrates and what he was executed for, which among other things was denying the state gods, bringing in weird foreign new gods and corrupting the youth. Socrates talked a lot about the daimon, and he also talked about hot theos, the god. He talked about hot theos as a divine creator being. He talked about the daimon again as this sort of spirit between god and mortal or guardian angel type thing. But he also kept up the practices of state religion, and according to Plato, his last words were, "I owe a cock to Asclepius. Will you see that the debt is paid?" Plato was obviously emphasising that Socrates was innocent of what he was accused of by having those be his last words. And I made a very brief reference to Plato's Symposium, his famous dialogue on love, where the host of the party is Agathon. Plutarch's vision of the afterlife here incorporates the concept of metempsychosis, or the transmigration of souls. This is basically reincarnation. I think one of the reasons for using the different words is using Greek words, metempsychosis from Greek, and also to differentiate this from Eastern religions and Eastern theology around reincarnation, which is obviously similar but not quite the same. But the idea of the transmigration of souls was a feature of the Orphic mystery religion and of Pythagorean and Platonic philosophy, and by extension of Pythagorean mystery religion as well. I should say at this point that we do know that Plutarch was initiated into at least one mystery cult, because he wrote a letter to his wife on the death of their granddaughter saying she should take comfort from the beliefs that they share, from the mysteries that they've both been initiated into. He doesn't specify which one, most likely the Eleusinian mysteries dedicated to Demeter and Persephone, which are probably the oldest mystery cult, they're more Orpheus, or it might have been the cult of Bacchus or Dionysus. In fairness, it could also have been the Orphic or Pythagorean cults. Probably not the Pythagorean one, that would have come through more strongly in his philosophical writing. The idea of the transmigration of souls is that when we die, our souls go into new bodies, human or animal. In Plato's myth of the souls are able to choose their new body. So the mythological character Atalanta, who's famous for running and being very athletic, chooses to go into the body of an athlete for her next life, that kind of thing. And the souls fly away like stars to join their new body. So that is obviously the main influence on Plutarch describing the similar system of transmigration of souls here, but it's something that appears across quite a lot of Greek philosophy. I mentioned that my interest in this is primarily as an example of a near-death experience, an NDE. I should say that Jan Bremmer has tended to dismiss pretty much all the ancient reports of near-death experiences as not actually being near-death experiences for various reasons. Usually this particularly relates to the heavy literary elements and things like, as I was saying, the fact that the myth of and the myth of Timarchus, they're clearly fictional. They're also kind of full of these kind of heavy philosophy lessons that don't really sound a lot like anyone's actual lived experience of a near-death experience. But I agree with Gregory and with Van der Sluijs that discounts the fact that they clearly do incorporate elements of near-death experiences that they presumably knew of from knowing of people who've had those experiences or knowing stories of those experiences, even if this specific story is not a specific person's story. They've drawn on what's known about them to create a fictional story. So although I added one or two extra elements, particularly Lamprocles being there, to my fictionalized version, a lot of it is genuinely there. One particularly interesting aspect is the whirring noise that Timarchus hears as he leaves his body. In this text, that seems to be related to the music of the spheres, which is then described again shortly afterwards, the sound of the heavenly bodies rotating. But it also has a connection with real-life near-death experiences where people often hear a strange whirring noise at the point that they are kind of having this experience of leaving their body. And Van der Sluijs noted that the story of Timarchus scores 7 out of 16 on his list of characteristic elements of a near-death experience. So those 7 are out-of-body experience with whirring sound, observation of an otherworldly beautiful landscape, and the hellish bit as well, because Timarchus sees both, encounter with a being of light or guide, a flash forward, which is that ominous prophecy at the end, and a forced return. And towards the end of his near-death experience, Timarchus is told that he himself will be dead by the end of the 3rd month. This kind of death omen is not uncommon in all sorts of ancient literature around supernatural and paranormal experiences. Quite often it'll be ghosts coming to tell people they're going to die or they're going to die soon. I think we've seen at least a couple of examples of that in previous episodes of this podcast. Propertius' poem about the ghost of Cynthia springs to mind, partly because it's my favourite. But while the specific omen of death aspect might be particularly Greco-Roman, the idea of some kind of flash-forward experience is a bit broader. So I've touched on some really complex issues incredibly briefly there. This is such a rich text and there's so much to say about it, and it's really hard to kind of boil it down to its essence. Basically, Plutarch is talking about the daimon as this kind of conscience/guardian/divine aspect of people's souls, the psyche, that if we follow it and we are rational and don't give in to the temptations of the flesh and all that stuff, then we can go and maybe escape the cycle of death and rebirth, or at least have a pleasant experience, and that people get sucked down into Hades who become completely absorbed by the concerns of the flesh and who ignore this higher part of themselves. But basically, there's so much that's so fascinating here, I just thoroughly recommend further reading. So, primary sources, you can read Plutarch's text on the Daimonion of Socrates, often called On the God of Socrates or On the Genius of Socrates. You can read that at Bill Thayer's Lacus Curtius site, which has loads and loads of Roman period texts available in translation. You can read Pausanius, you're looking for Book 9, Section 39 at Thayer.com's collection of classical texts. The Orphic gold tablets have been published in a book called Ritual Texts for the Afterlife, edited by Fritz, Graf and Sarah Iles Johnston. And you can read Apuleius' Metamorphoses in a really good modern translation at Poetry in Translation under the title The Golden Ass, a title that novel is often known by to avoid confusing it with Ovid's Metamorphoses. Personally, I much prefer Apuleius to Ovid, so I tend to grant him his original title. As a reminder, Gregory Shushan's books The Next World, Extraordinary Experiences of the Afterlife and Near-Death Experience in Indigenous Religions are both available now. Obviously, his work on Greek and Roman near-death experiences is not available yet because we're still working on it. Well, he is working on it and I am looking at it. If you're interested in the connection of things like this with Greek mystery cults and with mystery rites, then I recommend Yulia Ustinova's article in the Bulletin of the Institute of Classical Studies, 2013, volume 56, number 2, which is called To Live in Joy and Die with Hope, Experiential Aspects of Ancient Greek Mystery Rites. I actually barely had time to skim the article. I spotted the connections myself from knowing the primary sources, but Ustinova goes into lots more detail on it. I did make a lot of use of Marinus van der Sluis's article 3 Ancient Reports of Near-Death Experiences, Bremmer Revisited in the Journal of Near-Death Studies, volume 27, number 4 from 2009. Bremmer's book, with which we all so vehemently disagree, is called The Rise and Fall of the Afterlife, the 1995 Reed-Tuckwell Lectures at the University of Bristol. It's from 2002. I also had a look at Mark Riley's chapter, The Purpose and Unity of Plutarch's Daimonion of Socrates. I found that online and I cannot track down where it is from. It looks to me like a chapter in an edited collection. If anybody knows which one, let me know. And if you are interested in Socrates' opinions about the gods and his atheism or lack thereof, then I have two contrasting sources for you to look at. M. Giordano Zaccaria's article, As Socrates Shows the Athenians Did Not Believe in Gods, from Newman, volume 52, number 3 from 2005. And then strong disagreement with her conclusions from Henk Versnell's Coping with the Gods, Wayward Readings in Greek Theology, from one of his appendices at the end. I've just learned that Versnell sadly passed away very recently, so condolences to all his friends and family. I met him once, lovely man, and fascinating work. Thank you so much for listening to the podcast. There is a book version, Creepy Classics, Ghost Stories from Ancient Rome, which collects 12 of the ancient Roman stories that have featured on this podcast, plus one 13th book exclusive story, so there's some incentive to pick it up even if you've listened to every episode. That's available in paperback or ebook from Amazon and is in Kindle Unlimited. Volume 2, Creepy Classics, Ghost Stories from Ancient Greece, will be coming out this spring and will feature this very story. I also have a new monthly newsletter where I will be sharing book news and historical fun facts I've uncovered, which you can subscribe to on Substack. And Creepy Classics has its own YouTube channel now, also called Creepy Classics, which is just another place to listen to the podcast. If any of this stuff has interested you, check out my other YouTube channel, Classical JG, with new videos going up weekly, and I will be doing a video on near-death experiences in Greek and Roman texts next week, so keep an eye out for that if you'd like to hear about some more of those. And you can find me on Threads as Classical JGH and Blue Sky at Classical JG. And until next time, thank you so much for listening. Bye! Creepy Classics was written and performed by Ed Harrisson. Music composed and performed by Ed Harrisson, with vocals by Olivia Knops. It was produced by Ed Harrisson with assistance from Birmingham Newman University.